The Wilds of Patagonia, by Carl Skottsberg, published in London, by Edward Arnold, year 1911. Part 3, Chapter 10, Across the Andes into Argentina. Before we undertook the journey to the Patagonian channels, we had resolved to move our field of work to a more northerly latitude during the rest of the winter, and I have already described the excursions made between July and September 1908. Naturally, we had also discussed how we were to return south again, and the idea of proceeding overland, i.e., going on horseback from Lake Nahuelhuapi to Punta Arenas, had also suggested itself. We did not conceal from ourselves that it would be a risky enterprise. When we left Sweden, we were by no means prepared for such an eventuality, and therefore had not even studied what had been written describing that part of the country. This lack could in part be supplied, but not completely, and we did not miss any chance of getting information about Patagonia from persons who had personal experience. As to the equipment suitable, the way of arranging a caravan, and the technical side of the matter, Quenzel had gained very useful experience from his strenuous summer round Paine and Lake Argentino. The financial difficulty was the worst to get over. We were told we could not start with less than 50 horses, and I dare say this was no exaggeration from a South American point of view. But we could not dream of any such number. Our money would not permit of our buying more than 10 or 12 altogether. Anyhow, we made up our minds to risk it, hoping that by marching at moderate speed and resting the horses every third or fourth day, we should manage with the smaller number. By the kindness of the Argentine and Chilean governments, we had received complete sets of the maps of the Boundary Commission, and had had ample time to study them in all details. Unlike our predecessors, we regarded guides as unnecessary. With a map and a good compass, one should certainly be able to get along everywhere, letting common sense determine the details of the march. In general, fixed, scientific ideas must lead us, and the usefulness of vaquianos, guides, who can never read a map, would most probably turn out to be illusory. On the other hand, it was necessary to get hold of a good and strong all-round man to accompany us the whole time, as we did not want always to be tied by all the regular daily routine work. It is not easy here to light upon reliable people for such a purpose, and one ought not to take anybody into one's service without strong recommendations from trustworthy persons. When we left Punta Arenas, we had told Pagels that we should perhaps send for him later on, and we never had cause to regret that at last we resolved to do so. I telegraphed to him to join our party in Puerto Montt or at Nahuelhuapi, and he declared himself willing to come. Briefly, our plan ran as follows. We were to cross the Perez Rosales Pass to Nahuelhuapi, and there complete our equipment, buy horses, and see. Our way at first would lead along the mountain across the high Pampas, then run between the main range and the Mesetas, across the Transandine valleys and close to the east end of the large lakes. On some of them boat excursions would be undertaken. Everywhere we would avail ourselves of all possible chances of penetrating westward into the mountains. Our scientific purpose was to gain a series of geological and phytogeographical observations along the mountains, as well as on some sections across them to the Pacific Ocean. Before I invite the reader to follow us across the frontier to the neighboring republic, I shall make some few remarks on the more important surveys made in the interior of Patagonia. The shipwreck of Camarga in the Magellan Straits in 1540, as well as the unhappy result of Sarmiento's colonizing enterprise in 1584, gave birth to all sorts of stories. It was said that survivors of these disasters had wandered into the interior of Patagonia, where they had found immense treasures and established a settlement, which by and by had developed into a flourishing city, mentioned in the tales as La Ciudad de los Césares, the town of the emperors. No grounds whatever for such a supposition existed, but that, of course, did not hinder the place from becoming the chief attraction for a large number of expeditions, which tried to penetrate into the mysteries of Patagonia, and succeeded in doing so during the 17th and 18th centuries. Now and again a rumor cropped up of the enchanted city, where the natives had prohibited the white men from going back to their own countries, and even today there are ignorant people who still believe it. I myself have met one fellow who was sure of the existence of such a city, and he was an educated man. In 1621, Captain Flores de Leon started with an expedition from Calbuco, near Port Montt. He discovered the Perez Rosales Pass and reached Nahuelhuapi, where he encountered numerous savage Indians. And probably he is not the only one who made that journey at so early a date. Soon the Jesuit mission on Chiloé tried to effect communication with the east side of the Cordillera, and on one of his journeys Father Moscardi founded a station on the shore of Nahuelhuapi in 1670. Under changing fortunes it existed until 1717, when the Puelche Indians completely destroyed it. Investigations now ceased for a time, but at the end of the 18th century we find new brave pioneers setting out, and in the south the first expedition penetrated far inland. Antonio de Viedma in 1782 marched from San Julian, on the Atlantic coast, across the Pampas to the foot of the mountains, where he discovered the big lake now named after him. We must skip some years to find any dates worthy of mention in this brief summary. The glorious expeditions of the Adventure and the Beagle, well known to all English readers, opened a new era of modern scientific investigations, and Captain Fitzroy, accompanied by Charles Darwin, in 1834 pulled up the Santa Cruz River. From the point at which they were forced to return they beheld the depression where Lake Argentino is situated, but not until 1867 was this big lake discovered by the English engineer H. Gardiner. R.A. Filippi, C. Fonck, and others in the 50s started to explore the regions of Llanquihue and Nahuelhuapi, and in 1862 William Cox, an ancestor of the Swedo-Chilean family Schonmeier, made a famous journey to Nahuelhuapi and went down the rapids of Rio Lime, till he got shipwrecked and was made prisoner by the Indians. We owe him a debt of gratitude for a great deal of information about the natives. Later Captain G. Musters made prolonged journeys through the land of the Tehuelches and rescued the knowledge of their habits and customs from oblivion. However, large, white patches still remained along the foot of the Cordilleras. The man who has gained the greatest merit for their exploration is Dr. F. P. Moreno, late director of the museum in La Plata. In my opinion his travels well match most of those made in our days, and if his name is not so well known in Europe the fault is ours, not his. In the years 1875 to 1880 he crossed Patagonia in all directions, often amidst great dangers. More than once he nearly lost his life. He and his companions were the first to reach Nahuelhuapi from the east. Together with Moyano he discovered Rio de la Leona, the outlet of Lago Viedma in Lago Argentino, and also the Great Lake San Martin. Later he became the leading spirit of the Argentine Boundary Commission, when a piece of geographical work almost without parallel was performed. In 1880 Moyano made an expedition from Santa Cruz along the valley of Rio Chico, and thence to the north, and he was the first white man who beheld the vast surface of Lake Buenos Aires. Another prominent Argentine explorer was R. Lista. Long before these important events, Argentina as well as Chile had begun to think of expansion, Argentina towards Patagonia, the cramped Chile through the Transandine valleys out over the east slopes of the mountains. Thus a boundary dispute arose, carried on with great heat by both parties. It was deemed to have been brought to an end by the Treaty of 1881, which settled that the Cordillera should constitute the boundary, and thus the ground for dispute seemed to be removed. Commissions were established to regulate the matter, but soon all negotiations were broken off. A new controversy had arisen. It was found that for long distances the water parting did not coincide with the highest mountain ridges, but lay east of it, and the Chileans considered that the water divide ought to be the frontier. The Argentines that only the highest peaks and crests would make a just and natural boundary. The question was of great importance, as the dispute involved the fertile Subandine valleys, which with every reason were considered a good field for future colonization. However, matters could not be settled as long as the region was not mapped, and in the 90s a fine piece of work was accomplished, in which several Scandinavians also took part as cartographers. The Argentine exploration resulted in a large work, accompanied by splendid photographs and numerous maps. We could see now how much was still left to be discovered. Large lake basins, such as Fontana La Plata, Belgrano Azara Nansen, Pueyrredon, Cochrane, Posadas, the last one as late as in 1898. Sometimes naturalists also accompanied the expeditions. From the Chilean side efforts were made to start from the fjords on the Pacific coast and penetrate up the rivers through the mountains to the sources, enterprises associated with tremendous difficulties. Dr. Stefan, the well-known geographer, surveyed the river systems of Puelo Manso, Palena Caranlufu, Cisnes, Asen and Baker. Dr. Kruger those of Renihu and the numerous lakes east of it, Yelcho Fudalufu and Corcovado. The data having been gathered, the question was submitted to the award of King Edward VII, in order to prevent a terrible war. The king sent a commission under the command of Colonel Sir Thomas Holditch, and in November 1902 the decision was published and the boundary was settled. After this combined work was undertaken to erect the marks, new geographical results being gained. The Chilean government published a work in several parts with numerous maps, and the keystone was laid in 1908, when the Argentine description of the demarcations appeared. Private expeditions had also operated in Patagonia during this time. Dr. Hatcher with the Princeton University expedition occupied himself in the interior of South Patagonia, discovered Rio Mayor, the outlet of the Belgrano system, and did important geological work. The geologists Hothall and Roth made extensive surveys, the former principally in the southernmost part of the country, also visited by the Swedish expedition of 1896–97. In 1903 Mr. A. the Sleff, a Finnish gentleman, crossed Patagonia in order to look for land fit for cultivation. With him went the Swedish botanist P. Dussin, who brought home large collections from the region between Santa Cruz and the lakes San Martin and Viedma. Many smaller journeys are worthy of notice, but I must confine myself to those already mentioned. There was still, however, a vast field for scientific work. The winter was coming to an end. In the forests round Reloncaví the trees opened their flower buds. In Puerto Montt we enjoyed the first real spring days. We were now more busy than ever, the question being to choose a complete but light equipment, and to pack the rest in the winter collections and send all together to Punta Arenas. Our modest resources were severely strained buying horse gear, clothes, and a lot of small things. The last nails were driven into the boxes, which were sent down to a shed to wait for the next steamer, and with a ridiculously small amount of luggage we started for Puerto Varas at the Lago Lanquihue on October 6th. One is able to drive there very comfortably, for we had not yet said goodbye to civilization, and were ordinary passengers. A German-Chilean company, the leaders being Germans, called Compañía Comercial y Ganadera Chile Argentina, owns land on both sides of the mountains, and has established regular traffic between Port Montt and Bariloche at Nahuelhuapi. A route like this in Europe would certainly be crowded with tourists, and prove a real gold mine. But the everyday Chilean has not got his eyes open to the beauty of his country. Seldom does he travel for pleasure in South America. And when a foreigner has his holidays he goes to Europe, where he will hardly find anything so magnificent as the journey from Chile to Argentina across the Pérez Rosales Pass. In the evening our carriage stopped in front of the Hotel Lanquihue in Puerto Varas. On the road we had passed the half-completed railway joining Puerto Montt to the town of Osorno, and thus with the longitudinal main trunk. There is peace and comfort in that small summer place, Puerto Varas, where numerous families spend the favorable season on the shores of the large lake. We have good luck, the sun rises on a splendid day, and the small steamer takes us over a lake like a mirror, between the two famous giant volcanoes Osorno and Calbuco, which raise their shining white heads one on each side of the east end of Lanquihue. What a contrast to the landscape farther west, with pastures and cultivated fields between the grooves. German colonists have changed the province of Lanquihue into a land literally flowing with milk and honey, for butter and honey are valuable articles of export. The honey has a rather peculiar taste, but the bees have to collect it from plants very different from those we can offer them. From an aesthetic point of view Osorno is an ideal volcano. The cone, 7,403 feet high, is very regular, and covered with a cap of eternal snow. It is a long time since it showed any signs of life. The last eruption must be that described in his usual fascinating manner by Darwin, who was lucky enough to witness it. Calbuco is more than 1,600 feet lower, and has not the same regular shape, but is still active. With the glasses we could see tiny puffs of white smoke between the snowdrifts on the jagged crest. Old Vulcan still has one of his forges there, and one day or other he will blow his biggest bellows again. Then the industrious people will tremble. Mud streams will again drench their fields. Again the cattle will wade in the burning hot ashes with hanging tongues, as some years ago, when the sky became dark far away in Ankit in the middle of the day. We land at the foot of Osorno. One of the old lava streams comes down there, a picture of devastation, where vegetation still struggles to give some life to the stony desert. Horses are ready. We mount and gallop across the neck of land to the next lake, to Dos Los Santos, and go on board a small steam launch. Calbuco now lies behind. This lake has been called one of the most beautiful in the world. Perhaps this is an exaggeration, I have not seen enough to judge, but it is certainly magnificent. Over its mountains, virgin forests, and dark blue water there is a peculiar charm. It is an enchanted lake if there be one in this world. What a play of light and shadow on its surface, what colors when the sun is painting the peaks with gold and crimson, throwing longer and longer shadows over the calm water. Slowly the rosy gleam fades away. Last of all Osorno is seen glowing, flashing a while in the last beams, and then lies blue-white and cold. Night has come, forest and water melt together in the shadow of the mountains, but on the peaks the moon casts its light. Osorno is wonderful in its silver cap. As we advance new, fantastic peaks appear. We turn with the lake, catch a glimpse of Tronador, and land in Pulla. The day had filled our minds with delight, but the body had been neglected, and we were glad to see a laid table again, not having had anything since the early breakfast. The manager of the company in Pula, Mr. Roth, proved of great help in realizing our plans. The next day he arranged an excursion to Tronador, the Thunderer, a mountain 11,382 feet high, partly covered by 5 glaciers, making a noise that gave its name to the mountain. With good horses we rode through the beautiful forest to Casapengue, at the foot of the Andes, where one makes the ascent to the pass. Here mules more suited to the ground were waiting. Along the stony bed of a glacier stream we slowly approached a large glacier, coming down right into the forest, a remarkable sight. The morning had been very fine, but we knew that rain could not be far off, and just as we had tied up the animals in the dwarf forest the first drops came, followed by a proper Chilean storm. We climbed across the huge moraines onto the ice border itself, which is somewhat curious. All the lower part is covered by sand and gravel, and the glacier advances so very slowly that vegetation has time to take possession of it. There are small groves of dwarf trees, some getting not less than 20 or 30 years old before they are carried down to destruction. One may walk in the soft carpet of mosses and scrub without suspecting anything. Suddenly a crack opens, showing the sheer ice, blue and cold. This is not unique, but I never met with anything like it before. By and by the rain, which increased to a veritable deluge, drove us from the place. The horsemen who arrived in Casapengue that night were in rather a miserable condition. There was literally not a dry thread on our bodies. We made a fire, undressed, and changed the place into a fine exhibition of dripping rags. Wrapped in blankets, we whiled away the time before nightfall with a game of cards, and our dark-eyed hostess made us a nice cazuela. The next morning we returned to Pula, and made excursions round it. The forests here still bear a marked resemblance to those on Chiloé. On October 10th we rode to Casapengue and got mules for the march across the pass, which is only 3,300 feet high. It had been a favorable winter, and the road, climbing zigzag up a steep, forest-clad slope, seemed good enough on horseback. The traffic with the bullock carts had not been opened yet. The difference in vegetation attracted our attention. The numerous leaf trees became fewer, needle trees more and more frequent. In the pass extensive snowdrifts were still left. For a short distance we rode on level ground, past the boundary mark, and came down into the deep grave where Laguna Fria is situated. Its icy green glacier water looks cold indeed, and it needs sunshine and fine weather if the shores, at the foot of perpendicular cliffs, many hundred yards high, are not to produce a gloomy or even terrifying impression. We pulled across and walked over the isthmus separating Laguna Fria and Nahuelhuapi, following a road in the forest down to Puerto Blest. One need not walk on foot. A car drawn by a bullock and running on wooden rails brings luggage and passengers down to the hotel. How easily we had reached the famous lake in comparison with the pioneers who risked their lives only to behold its blue water. It has been compared with the lakes in the Alps, but who knows if Nahuelhuapi does not bear away the palm? It has so many different aspects. Far to the west it washes the foot of the Andes, in narrow inlets reflecting the dark forests of Ilirce and Cedro, thickly wooded isles making the scenery more varied. In the east it opens into the endless widths of the Pampas. The mountains are left behind. The forests have dissolved into groves and patches. In Puerto Blest we counted on getting 1 day for excursions, and on the next we expected the steamer from Bariloche. It had, however, started to blow hard, and no steamer came, but a storm, first with rain and then with snow and cold. Winter made its expiring efforts. The shores were dressed in white, all the forest lay powdered with snow. We were shut in a miserable room, where a red-hot stove made life almost insupportable. We could not complain, however, for in our bedroom the thermometer refused to rise above freezing point. Thus we got a tolerable daily average. 1 day passed, 2, 3, during which the gale raged with unabated strength, making the house tremble at each gust. Finally on the 15th the sun showed its glorious face again. There was still a good breeze, but as it was an ordinary boat day we could be sure that every effort would be made to fetch us. In the afternoon the small steamer arrived after a rough voyage. The day had yet another surprise in store for us. When the bullock cart from Laguna Fria came rolling down the slope Pagels was enthroned on the top of the load, and after him came our old dog Prince lumbering along. An extra mail day brought letters and papers from Punta Arenas. Now all of us were assembled. Pagels had performed the commissions we had given him with exactitude, and we could go to bed and sleep a couple of hours, not more, for long before the sun gilded the surface of Nahuelhuapi we slipped out of the bosom of the Cordillera, to start a new kind of life, and for the future march with this gigantic fold of the Earth's crust to the west, whither we had been used to look out over the endless ocean. The small town, or rather village, Bariloche, was the destination of our steamer, and at the same time the starting point for our long ride. We tried to make ourselves comfortable in the small, dirty inn, and began our preparations without delay. Pagels occupied himself making saddle and provision bags, while we had some excursions to make. Bariloche is situated on the edge of the forest region. West of it are big cedar forests, Libocedrus chilensis, in the east a yellowish steppe. Several mountains exhibiting interesting geological features were easy to reach from there, and as we did not want to encumber our caravan with heavy collections at the very start, Quenzel and Halley made an excursion south for a couple of days. I myself went round the lake, ferried across Rio Lime, and stayed 2 days with an American gentleman, Mr. Jones. He has a big cattle ranch, with a stock of several thousand head, his special business being to breed mules, which fetch double the price of an ordinary horse. We had already solved our most important question, the horse problem, and were the happy owners of a small tropilla of 10 animals and a mare, the Yegua Madrina, without whom no troop keeps together. They were rather small, and looked like skeletons after the winter. 8 of them were saddle horses, each of us got 2 and the 2 others were to carry our baggage. Generally the horses in Patagonia are not shod, but as we were going to spend most of the time in the mountains we were forced to shoe them. Horses are cheap in Patagonia. In the spring prices seem to be higher, and we paid $60 each, about £5.6s. Our equipment was very simple indeed. We had no suits other than those we wore, and they were already old and shabby. The expedition also took 1 common pair of reserve trousers. Of underwear each of us had 2 shifts, but of socks we had a more ample supply. Most of the clothes, some necessary handbooks, perishable provisions, ammunition, a number of small, strong bottles of formalin or spirits, some instruments such as aneroids, thermometers, compasses, and films for the camera, a 3.5 by 4 3/4 inch. Kodak, notebooks, journals, and other small things were packed in 2 small waterproof English leather boxes, specially constructed to be attached to a pack saddle. We only carried 1 rifle, a Winchester of small caliber. We had serious intentions of bringing also a shotgun, but it disappeared in one of our numerous flittings before we reached our starting point. Firearms are always welcome in Patagonia, and I am pretty sure it is in use somewhere. Overcoats or cloaks we had none, but tied a poncho behind the saddle. Neither did we use riding boots, only leggings or puttees, certainly to be preferred when one has to walk much. The 2 chests made 1 horse load, at the top of which our coffee pot was tied. The second load consisted of a small tent for 2, very seldom used, but sometimes necessary to protect our equipment, a bag of provisions, and a small bag containing our kitchen requisites, which were of aluminium. The sleeping bags, a simple blanket bag with canvas covers, were used as underlayers for the loads, which were thereby prevented from galling the horse's sides. The load was fixed with a strong rope after Pagel's patent method, very practical but certainly not without intricate sailor's knots. Woe to him who tried, if only in the slightest degree, to deviate from the approved arrangement. Pagels at once told him the truth. Every load was of about 150 pounds. Quite sufficient if one takes into consideration that the pack horses had to work all March days, the saddle horses only every second day. Besides our own weight, they carried also the maletas, containing various articles of apparel, camera, plant press, and there also the collections made during a march were stowed away. Perhaps I ought also to say some words about our horse gear. The pack saddles were almost new. They had only been used for Quenzel's travels, and were of the common South American type. Our saddles made a varied show, 1 English, 1 half English, half Chilean, 1 of the Falkland pattern, and 1 Argentine Recado. The rest of the harness was pure Patagonian, Bozal and Cabresta, always carried in the hand with the reins. The stirrup had the usual leather protection, the whip was a common rebenque. The provisions were of the most simple kind. They were calculated for 1 month only, during which we certainly counted on the renowned Patagonian hospitality, and consisted of the following articles: ship's biscuits, flour, rice, oatmeal, coffee, tea, cocoa, mate, dried fruit, sugar, salt, and fat. Luxuries such as butter, condensed milk, and were, of course, not to be thought of. A concentrated pea soup, called Nor's Erbsenwurst, we carried a supply of for the whole journey, as well as plug tobacco. October 23rd dawned with radiant Pampas weather. For the first time we saddled, and it took us a good while to get ready, and not until 11:30 could the caravan start. The solemn time had come, and, driving our troop in front of us, with good speed we left Bariloche, where people had only tried to fleece us. Before us a free life attracted us, full of privations but far away from cash books and bills. With deep breaths we filled our lungs with the fresh Pampas air, bringing with it an undefinable sense of happiness and freedom. A group of Bariloche people had gathered to see our start. I dare say no one believed that we should get very far with our few horses, and no doubt they laughed at our dream of reaching Punta Arenas. Never did such a small caravan start in Patagonia on such a long and difficult journey. Never before had one reached its far-off destination with all the horses in even better condition than at the start. But we had burnt our boats, there was no return. We must succeed with the scanty resources we had at our disposal. In the very last moment our expedition got another member, a shaggy dog. He had made Prince's acquaintance in Bariloche and came lumbering with us. In vain we made the most energetic efforts to chase him away. He hung on, and followed us all the time under the name of Pavo. And then we took our faithful friend with us to Sweden, where he gained citizenship only by royal grace, for Argentina at that time was declared to be infected with rabies. Chapter 11. Through northern Patagonia. During the first few days our march was not attended by any difficulties, as we only followed the common track, here and there visible over the Pampas. On our right was the so-called pre-Cordillera, where outlines are softer and the snow patches insignificant. Deep ravines appear in the easily disintegrating tufas, and here dark forest groves extend, though not reaching down to where we were traveling. Behind and in front of us lay the broken ground of the high Pampas with hills and ravines, towards the east the endless undulating plains reaching far away to the Atlantic Ocean. The yellow sand gleams between tufts of stiff steppe plants and scented spring flowers, red or blue, yellow or white, now and then tempting me to alight to gather specimens. Everywhere the blue-green hillocks of Malinum spinosum, an umbelliferous plant, appear, together with the stiff tussocks of grasses, the most noticeable growths on the dry, sandy steppe. Almost everything is prickly. The shrubs are armed to the teeth, the leaves of the grass end in a sharp needle, breaking off at the slightest touch. If one sits down carelessly one soon jumps up again, spiny like an urchin, but with the important difference that the spines are turned towards one's own skin. Now and then a cactus is, PG 168, seen resting its growth on the stony soil. On the hills and plateaus vegetation is more scanty. It is almost a desert, red or yellow, strewn with sharp-edged stones, with stunted plants in the cracks, such as are specially fitted to endure the hardships of desert life. Sometimes they look like a tangle of spines, out of which some few brilliant flowers peep forth. Sometimes they are wrapped in a dense clothing of thick wool and have roots disappearing in the very bowels of the earth, where there is perhaps water to drink. The numerous spines are one of the nuisances of the steppe. Another is the wind, often blowing hard for a long time and enveloping us in a cloud of dust. But certainly we preferred this to the eternal rains of the west coast. Hours pass, the sun bakes us red or brown, the dust gathers in thicker and thicker deposits. The bell on the mare tinkles, the hoofs rattle on the hard ground. The horses, untrained as they are after a long winter's leisure, get less willing. One or other tries to pluck a mouthful of the rough yellow grass. We must show more energy in driving the troop, and Pagels is frequently heard shouting a verdemtes camel, in a very bad case increasing his anger to a heiliges Kanonenrohr, the strongest expression he is able to lay tongue to, and surely a relic of his service in the Navy. We welcome the small valley, our first camping place, where a tiny stream winds between thickets of near. Patches of green grass attract the horses. We find a nice and sheltered corner and unsaddle. One horse is chosen and tethered to a long rope. The others are simply let loose, with the exception of the PG 169 mare, who is provided with manillas round the front legs. So one is more or less sure of finding the troop in the neighborhood the next morning. The first campfire crackles, the mate makes its round, and a real fat asado of beef drips on the spit. Poor misguided vegetarians would not thrive here. Meat and meat again will probably always be the staple food of the Pampas. Here in Sweden we hardly know what good meat is. I learned to understand my Argentine friend from the Antarctic voyage, Jose Sobral, who deliberately shook his head at the stuff he was offered in Uppsala. I think that then I tried to defend it, but I have already withdrawn my defense. The delicious steak whets our appetite, and from curiosity one soon cuts into it to see if it has not got the right color. A pack saddle or the sleeping bag is our seat, a large piece of meat in one hand, the big sheath knife in the other. That's the way to eat asado. A couple of biscuits and a cup of cocoa end our meal, dinner and supper at the same time. Generally we only fed twice a day, put a piece of biscuit or cold meat, if there was any, in our pocket, and ate it during one of the halts we were forced to make to give the horses a spell of rest. They got thirsty and we wanted to stretch our legs. Darkness falls over the expanses, the stars come out, and our campfire more and more commands the surroundings. We gladly linger a while over our pipes. It is the most pleasant hour of the day, and, if possible, we want to prolong it. But there is a next day, and the thought of this makes us look for a bed in the bushes, spread out the bag, make a bundle of the clothes under the head, creep down, and enjoy the last whiff of smoke. Ah, these nights under the open sky. It seems almost a pity to sleep, now out in the open camp, where the barren sand gleams between the grass and the ghostly silhouette of a single bush stands against the sky, now under soughing trees, where the moonbeams seek a way through the black foliage. Cross and centaur wander the eternal road, the murmur of the stream is conducive to sleep. A ghostly cry breaks the stillness, our dogs prick up their ears and bark, only a hungry fox who has scented our pantry. From Pagel's bag comes a "Gut Nacht." One turns to find a comfortable position, and is soon at home among the firs and red-painted houses in the land far away, which now looks so marvelous to us. The night is clear and cold, and with great satisfaction we greet the first sunbeams that creep from the ocean all the way to the foot of the Andes. The day will get hot, and the thing is to get off when the freshness of the morning still lies over the land. First the morning toilet must be performed. The reader imagines, I should think, how we enjoyed a good wash in the purling brook. Alas! We also imagined it, but it was seldom accomplished in reality. It did not pay, for after half an hour's ride one was as dirty again, and we were more satisfied with occasional thorough cleanings on solemn occasions. But there was one paragraph in our Codex of Cleanliness from which there was no exception. He who was to make bread must first wash his hands. Work was certainly not lacking in the morning. Collections and notes had to be put in order, the breakfast prepared, and the horses driven to the camp, caught, and saddled. Every day I had plants to press, which I performed in a simple manner, for naturally the usual heavy plant presses were banished. But with 2 pieces of cardboard, a rope, and old newspapers I got in the settlements I managed all right. Breakfast consisted for the most part of porridge, meat, bread, when we had any, and coffee. It was soon eaten, cups and plates washed, the saucepan cleaned. This last job we took by turns, not even the palatable scrapings could make it enjoyable. The watch horse was saddled, we must look for the others. In most cases this did not give us much trouble, because when it was possible we carefully chose good pasture. It was much worse to catch the horses. With the ropes we made a corral, easy enough in the forest, but often very tedious when out on the open Pampas, where hardly a single suitable bush could be discovered. Some of the animals were easy to catch, but others tried our patience, hiding amongst their fellows or breaking away. Finally the full number of 6 were tied and we started to saddle. We always saddled our own horses, and soon got very expert at handling all sorts of gear. The loads lay ready waiting, nothing was forgotten, and the first camping ground disappeared behind a hill. We could soon distinguish our destination for the second day, a single rust-brown peak, called Pico Quemado, the Burnt. Following the Cordillera, the track went ceaselessly uphill and downhill, but the monotony was broken when suddenly the load on one of the horses loosened. We stopped and tried to catch him, but he bolted at once. The load slipped round, terrible kicks struck the boxes, and our coffee pot soon was changed into a tragicomic, completely useless utensil. "It served you right, you ass," Pagel said, when the beast at last lay there, entangled in the rope. By and by we gained more experience, though not a day elapsed when we had not to rearrange the loads. The whole day we were ascending, it grew colder, and the wind freshened and felt biting cold in spite of the northerly latitude. At 4,900 feet we reached the pass, and made downhill towards a small stream on the south side of Pico Quemado. Another day and we came across the first houses, a small settlement, and in the evening stopped in front of a large wooden house in Ñorquinco. Here the Chile Argentina Company has established a branch. The place is as typical of civilized Patagonia as we could wish. An iron shed for the telegraph office, where floats a faded Argentine flag, a boliche with horse gear, bunches of stirrups and spurs, hanging from the roof, a pile of sheepskins thrown into a corner, heaps of clothing, gaudy handkerchiefs, black, huge brimmed hats, knives and revolvers, long rows of tin boxes with multicolored labels, And last, but not least, the cantina. The bar with wine barrels, shelves of bottles in all the shifting colors of the rainbow, pisco, a weak Chilean brandy, aerogenous menta liqueur, Jamaica rum with its nigger head, whiskey and brandy, some champagne bottles and the wash-up tub, where the glass is dipped an instant before it is offered to the next customer. Outside of the traditional barrier, some horses are tied, waiting for their masters. And they will have to wait. The dice are thrown, laughter echoes within the walls. Swarthy individuals, pure Indians dressed in poncho and wide trousers, pulled together at the wrist, white socks, and a pair of slippers, Chileans, Argentiners, and gringos, strangers. A dirty policeman, dressed in the remains of a uniform, hangs about the bar. Conversation stops for a moment when we enter. Evidently we do not look like everyday comers and they gaze curiously at our cargo. The social tone is free and friendly here. You suddenly find yourself a member of the party. A glass is thrust into your hand, salute, to right and left, and then it is your turn to order a round. If one has any idea of Patagonian customs, one takes care not to refuse. It might cost one dear. It was easy enough for us to get dinner and a bed, but we thought more of our horses. Everywhere here the scanty grass was gone, and as there were no paddocks we were anxious lest the horses should run away. A starved horse strays until he finds something to eat. At 7 in the morning the policeman rode away to look for our troop, and we awaited his return anxiously. And when he returned alone we knew the truth: the horses had gone. There are many points on the compass, but we must seek in all. Kind souls offered their services, others confined themselves to discussing matters and made all sorts of guesses. The inspector of police, who had arrived, declared that the horses most probably had gone back to Bariloche, and we sent a telegram there. Others were inclined to suspect that thieves had had a hand in it. One fellow looked at the inspector and whispered to me that the police perhaps knew. Well, it would not have been the first time a thing like that had happened in the Cordillera. A number of peons, camp laborers, were sent to look in different directions, and we strolled far away over the hills, provided with glasses. We saw some horses, but not ours. At noon, however, one of the men returned with the mare and 5 horses, but the other 5 had strayed away. New guests arrived in the evening. Our horses were the favorite topic, and if good advice had been able to do anything, certainly there was plenty. We went to bed in a miserable state of mind. 5 horses gone. We could not buy others without getting into debt, and who knew if anybody would be willing to give unknown strangers credit? And without these horses, the caravan reduced to half, it would prove impossible to carry out our scheme, an ignominious end to our bold hopes. The next day we arranged a systematic search. Indian peons got the description of the horses, and were promised a reward if they brought them back. They intended to track them down. The horses were shod, it is true, and therefore easy to distinguish from others, but the hardness of the ground and the strong wind would make matters more difficult. We resolved to continue our march with the rest of the caravan, leaving Pagels behind to watch over our interests and make inquiries of people all round in his beautiful Spanish. However, we had almost lost hope of seeing our animals, some of them good horses, any more, and began to believe that thieves had driven them out of the way on purpose, only waiting for us to lose patience and leave the place, an old Patagonian trick often employed with profit. We left Ñorquinco and followed a cart track, after a while turning to the west, through a very distinct pass, a true portezuelo, leading down into the valley of Rio Chubut. Large herds of cattle were grazing on the well-watered meadows, and, hungry as they were, our horses would not have refused a good meal, but time did not permit of this. Rio Chubut, one of the largest rivers of Patagonia, is here only small, though sometimes so swollen that it is difficult to cross. Now there was not much water, and we easily reached the small estancia Maiden, where we stopped for the night. Only the wife of the capataz, the boss, was at home, and at first she did not seem very willing to welcome us, but after a while promised to cook some food and let us sleep in the peons' quarters. I do not blame her, for the master of the home was away and we might have been a band of rascals, a possibility not at all contradicted by our appearance. A gentleman rider in Patagonia brings several servants, and if one does any sort of work usually left to the peons, this never evokes admiration, but only sheer astonishment. As on every estancia 1 or 2 horses are tethered for the night, we let ours go, and in the morning a peon promised to fetch them. He went away all right, and came back after 2 hours, without the horses. He had not gone in the right direction, he said. A traveler, a kind fellow, who had spent the night with us, offered to fetch them himself, and finally, at noon, they came. The peon had been there, for a bozal that we had left on one of the pack horses in order to catch him with less trouble was gone. There was no time to look for it. It was nearly 1 o'clock, and we had a ride of 31 miles in front of us. Over easy ground we followed the Chubut River till it bent to the east, and at nightfall reached the Lelege Valley, where we soon perceived a group of large buildings, indicating a big farm. It was the headquarters of the English-Argentine Land Company, whose manager, Mr. Preston, welcomed us in a very kind manner. Lelege is typical of a large cattle farm. In a low building of red brick, the ground is cheap, so there is no reason to make houses of more than 1 story. Are the lodgings, offices, shops, and stores. All round are various workshops, such as a carpenter's and a blacksmith's shop, the house of the bosses, and the plain ranchos of the peons. In the vicinity one does not look in vain for the piles of fuel, brought there from a long distance, the great, ever-increasing heap of empty tin boxes, the bulky, high-wheeled bullock carts, and the rolls of wire. Round the houses stretch smallish potreros or paddocks, for the hundreds of horses in daily use, and away over the hills the fences run straight as an arrow. The peons are a peculiar class of people. Pure Indians or mestizos, they are nearly all doomed to eternal bachelorhood. One can hardly imagine a married peon. All day they spend on horseback, at night they crawl in on the earthen floor round the cauldron with puchero hanging down from the roof, feed, smoke a cigarette, take innumerable cups of mate, then, wrapped in a blanket, they sleep on some rags in a corner. Pleasures of life take the form of mate and tobacco, and, of course, spirit, when they can get it. Here's the home of a peon today. Tomorrow he does some foolish thing, takes too long a siesta, perhaps, and is sent off. In 5 minutes he has packed together his property, put them and himself on a horse, and has galloped away to seek fortune elsewhere. Of course, he has horses, often a whole drove. Horses multiply and there is always pasture. But light come, light go. An attracting pub, an unscrupulous publican, and after some days of splendid intoxication he rides away on a borrowed horse. A peon who saves his pay puts it all into his horse trappings. One can see him in his Sunday clothes with a small fortune of silver on the horse, an ancient custom inherited from Tehuelche or Araucanian ancestors. It is curious to think that not many years ago this vast land was the free battlefield of the Indian, he who now is its most humble servant, whom any stranger with a piece of land thinks it fitting to kick and insult, always letting him understand that he belongs to an inferior race, living at the intruder's mercy. Sometimes it happens that he gains the confidence of his master, is promoted to capataz and gets his own house, and should it happen that a girl finds her way out to the camp, he may get a family also. A common peon she does not look at. There are always persons of higher rank who are glad to take care of her. Life in Lelege goes like clockwork. All the employees are Englishmen or Scotchmen and have brought their customs to the new country. On the stroke of 6:30 they are sitting at breakfast, where every passing gentleman may be sure of a seat and a mutton chop. The bread is as English as one could wish, and luncheon or dinner arrives with magnificent beef or roast mutton. And if one discovers a football or golf clubs it is nothing astonishing. Lelege appeared to us a very well-managed enterprise, where people work ceaselessly. The greatest difficulties these settlements in the Andes have to contend with are the bad communications. Everything goes by cart to the Atlantic coast, making journeys lasting weeks and months, under great difficulties of finding water on the half-desert-like plains. Great railway schemes are now spoken of, or even started, and then Patagonia will be able to show what she is capable of. Lelege was the last telegraph station, and we were in continuous communication with Ñorquinco. All hope seemed gone, as Pagels asked permission to buy a new horse and join us, but I asked him to stop another day, which proved to be a piece of luck. We had plenty of work in the neighborhood, made a ride up in the mountains, where snow still lay in the forests, just dressed in the verdure of spring. Quenzel visited the flourishing Cholila Valley in the west, and Halley was busy collecting fossils. However, we worked with depressed spirits. Certainly Mr. Preston had promised to guarantee us money if we telegraphed to Buenos Aires for some. He had no horses to sell us himself. Later it proved that it would have been very difficult to get any. We did not want to get the expedition into debt, as it was our pride to make an exception to the rule. November came, still no news. Then, on November 2nd, like a sunbeam from an overclouded sky came the following telegram. Hey noticias de caballos perdidos. Señor Pagels fue traerlas. Seguir a viaje mañana. Or, lost horses traced. Mr. Pagels gone to fetch them, continues his journey tomorrow. The title plainly showed that Pagels had understood how to inspire due respect. It had been sent the day before, and we could expect him the same day, and were almost ready to embrace the fugitives when they appeared. Everything had nearly come to naught. Pagels had bought a horse on credit, and had one foot in the stirrup, when an Indian came on horseback and told him that he knew where the horses were. What a big weight was off our minds. Merry as before and with a complete caravan, we started for the next halting place, 2 days off. Now and then we put up ostriches, rhea, which flew in all directions with stretched wings, chased by our dogs, who could never overtake them. Now and then a small herd of guanacos passed, but they also left prince and pavo far behind. We had just unsaddled for the night at the side of a small tributary to Chubut, when on the other side of the water we saw the silhouettes of more than 100 guanacos against the evening sky. It would have been easy to get a good bag, but as long as we were in communication with settled parts, we need not leave a settlement without a couple of fine steaks added to the loads, and wild animals were safe from our bullets. Guarded by the Esquel Mountains, a large plain stretched before us, and far away we could see 2 high peaks, between which our way would run, through the so-called Nahuelpan Pass. It is a narrow but fertile valley, with small cornfields round the gray Indian ranchos, shadowed by small groves of cedars. We were not quite sure of the way to Clark's place, which we wanted to visit, and asked an Indian who passed us. He told us that we had missed our way, and would have to go back again, but also that if we continued through the pass we should strike Underwood's farm in Colonia XIII de Octubre. Certainly we had special reasons for seeing Clark. Preston had sent letters to him, and besides he was an educated man, a BA of an English university. But the detour would be too much for our animals, and we continued down to Underwood, where we arrived after a march of 34 miles. The neat little brick cottage lies embowered in a garden. Mr. Underwood was away, but his wife welcomed us, and we soon felt at home. By a happy chance Mr. Clark came driving there the same night, bound on a business journey through the valley, and thus we had the great pleasure of making his acquaintance. The Valle 16 de Octubre is one of the most fertile and populous of the Transandine valleys. It is watered by Rio Corintos, further down joining Rio Fudalufu, which empties into Lago Yelcho, in its turn discharging by Rio Yelcho into the Pacific. We stood by the same river where we had camped some months earlier, but the entire Cordillera was between the two places. Here Chile had certainly wanted to emphasize the principle that a water divide was the natural frontier, but as the valley had been colonized by Welshmen from Chubut, Trelew, Argentine kept the whole valuable part of it. We wanted to give our horses a rest and let them browse a few days, and Clark came with us to look for a farm where people would be willing to lend us horses for our excursions. Shut in by magnificent mountain chains, this valley is a real gem, green with vast meadows, wheat fields, and clover fields, adorned by nice country houses, where fruit trees and berry bushes, cauliflower and lettuce were a delight to behold. We became quite homesick when we rode through. At the schoolhouse we stopped. The children are taught in Welsh, but most of the people we met also spoke English and Spanish. We crossed Rio Corintos, where fat cows of English breeds grazed on the banks, and made a halt at a farm of very modest aspect. The owner, however, was a wealthy man. He was out marking colts, but his wife asked us to off-saddle and come in, and welcomed us with a mate. Then Don Antonio Miggins came. He received us very kindly indeed, promised us horses, and proved a thorough gentleman. He is, besides, a very original man. On November 6th we rode further into the valley with fresh horses. At the beginning we made good speed, then the valley narrowed and the patches of beautiful cedar forest, further east only growing in the ravines, closed into a dense covering on the steep slopes down to the broad river that rushed westward, embracing green islands. Ever since the time when the valley was explored from the Pacific side a path has been left, but it is anything but inviting, running up and down over neck-breaking barrancas, through thickets and stony places. The horses were used to this ground, and did not hesitate, but jumped over the barricades of fallen forest giants. One had better not sleep in the saddle, for one's knees are in continual danger from trunks and huge blocks. We met passages so intricate that we had to leave them to the horse's judgment. The only disaster that happened was that our coffee pot, the second, suffered a fatal shock. However, by giving it another kick we made it possible to use for the day. The vegetation more and more showed signs of the rainforest. Our old friends the beeches and myrtle trees appeared again, and when we reached the boundary mark high up on the south bank of the river Chile welcomed us with rain and fog. With a sense of regret we parted with the valley and sought a way south over very broken ground with dense brushwood here and there. making it difficult to keep together. We were not at all sure of having chosen the best way till we came in sight of Lake Rosario and the extensive peat bogs at its west end, where we passed it. Here Jeremiah's, one of the pack horses, thus named because he uttered strange, plaintive sounds when being saddled, got a chance to prove his eminent intelligence. We had suspected that he was not quite normal, and now made certain. He caught sight of some horses on the other side of the swamps, was seized by a sudden desire to make their acquaintance, and in a rapid gallop flew down the slope. We followed him as fast as our horses could carry us, but only arrived to see him sink down, kick in desperation, and disappear to his belly. It was a wet swamp of the worst kind, and we nearly lost him. At first all efforts proved futile, the ground would not bear us, but we managed to unload him, and thus saved both him and the load. At a tributary of Rio Caranlufu we camped for the night, and the next morning made for the main river. We had some trouble with our horses, as 2 of them had sore backs and could not be used. The least pressure of a saddle might render them useless for weeks. We tried to set a course straight for a settlement indicated on the Argentine map. The ground was very poor, innumerable ravines filled with thickets, and sometimes so wet that the horses had to wade in loose black mud over their knees. It was more by good luck than good management that we struck the house of Robert Day, where hospitality indeed had its abode. Seldom do you find its laws so strictly kept as in Patagonia. In the settlement of white men or the rancho of an Indian, everywhere you are received with open arms, and the best there is put on the table. Every effort is made to keep you there, never is the house too limited or the table too small. We shall never forget old Day, his jolly wife and swarm of children. The eldest sons had built their own cottages at other places in the valley. Day is a true pioneer of the old school, and in our Patagonian Baedeker we have marked him with 3 stars. Originally, he, as well as so many others, had come to look for the yellow metal, but finished in good time and now has a rather flourishing farm. However, he complained of the government. On repeated occasions he had offered to buy the ground, but never got a definite answer. He had lived there 17 years, but could not feel sure that he would not be chased away any day it pleased the authorities. Hitherto our direction had been more or less straight south, but from Caranlufu we bent eastward in order to visit the camp round Rio Teca, one of Chubut's sources, and at the same time make the acquaintance of one of the very few Swedes in Patagonia, Don Carlos Flach, of the well-known Swedish noble family. In Valparaiso we were told that he was manager on an estancia belonging to the Cochamo Company, named after Rio Cochamo, which discharges into the Reloncavi Inlet not far from Puerto Montt. There a road has been made across to the Pacific coast, but it is said to be passable only to riders. Only 1 day's march separated us from Pampa Chica, where the sought for estancia should be, but the track is rather ill-famed because of the extensive pantanos, and, according to Day, sometimes quite impassable. The saddle horses were happily brought over the bad places, but of course Jeremiah's was bogged and caused us trouble and loss of time. In the afternoon we came across a flock of the company's sheep. They were badly afflicted with scab, the wool hanging in tatters all round them. Well hidden by the foot of a hill there was Flach's cottage, and the master of the house was not a little astonished when 3 dusty riders greeted him in his own language. A merry encounter it was, and he at once offered to let us share his small hut. The lodge had burnt down some time previous to our arrival. The company seemed to be of the Yelcho sort. It had gone into liquidation and was selling the animals. Flach was about to leave, only waiting to get his money. He was thinking of getting a piece of camp further south. Again our horses could rest, for Flach lent us some for our excursions. The vegetation was glorious here, and I had plenty to do from morning to evening. It had proved more than necessary to get 2 more animals in order to change the pack horses, and this problem was solved in a most unexpected manner. Flach presented us with one, which belonged to nobody, but had been 2 years on the company's camp. Of course he was baptized Flach's, untranslatable Swedish pun. Flax is equals luck, and turned out one of our very best horses. Besides, we bought a small but good horse. Under the name of Johansson he carried me at least every second March day during the rest of the time. Of my horses I kept Solo, the largest of our animals, but the old Manas was degraded to a pack horse. Quenzel got Flax, Hallie took Jacob and gave Lazarus, a long time with a sore back, thus his name, Topagles, one of whose horses became a pack horse. The new horses learned to keep with our troop by getting coupled with the mare the first nights. This lady was not tame, and often annoyed us with her impertinent looks and her obstinacy. To ride a mare is hardly thinkable in Patagonia. Thus we considered ourselves well off, bought more provisions, and on November 15th left our new friend, whose small cottage soon disappeared from sight behind the yellow hills. Chapter 12. Through the Cordilleras to the Pacific coast. The Pampas visited during the following days showed us a new feature of Patagonian camp, the want of water and fuel, which makes the journeys from the settlements to the coast somewhat difficult. Had we not found some wood left from a cartload once sent by Flatch, we should have been confined to very dry food. The water was not of the best, full of innumerable small animals, larvae and crustaceans, but boiled it did not taste bad. Besides, there was more nourishment in it than there would have been otherwise. There was no lack of small lagoons, but they are all without an outlet, and round their edge is a thick white crust of salt. The water is bitter as gall. In spite of that, one likes to stop there a while to enjoy the spectacle offered by thousands of beautiful water birds. Large flocks of bright flamingos walk about in the mud, hundreds of black-necked swans glide round their large nests, resting in the bulrushes. Nearer to the edges moorhen and many waders have their quarters. Large fat geese walk round cackling on the shore, and small ducks run through the channels in the salt-powdered reeds. Every find of eggs is welcomed for our kitchen. In the valley of Rio Pico we again met people, German settlers brought in by a company to drive sheep and cattle farm. They also wanted to try agriculture, and had a nice garden already. As usual, we were received exceedingly well, and my journal says that we slept on mattresses, a rare pleasure. Before us lay a meseta, a table mountain built up of loose deposits, which we had to cross. The mesetas are characteristic of the Rand zone of the Andes. Further south they have a cover of basalt, making it difficult or even impossible to cross them with horses. This plateau did not offer any difficulties, but, instead of that, features of great interest, which also made progress slow. We ascended to a height of about 3,300 feet, and went down into the Frias or Cisnes Valley. The large Frias River originates far east of the mountains, but nevertheless discharges into the Pacific Ocean, and here for a stretch Chile's proposal for the boundary was approved at the award. The piece of land is of slight importance. Only in the eastern part is there good grass. Proceeding westward, one soon gets into impenetrable virgin forests. At first we looked in vain for any trace of people. We did not know where the estancia was, and it was almost dark, when, at a distance of about 2 miles, we sighted the well-known houses, proving the existence of another customer of the Corrugated Iron Company, Limited. The company in the Frias Valley, as others in Chile and Patagonia, has got leasehold for a number of years. After that time the land is disposed of by auction, and it is considered that the company should be able to give the best tender. One of the conditions for the concession is that a road is made through the mountains to the Pacific coast, in order to provide communication with the rest of Chile. At the present all transport goes to the Atlantic, and only Argentine money is used. The company has not started the work with the road yet, and nobody knows if it will ever be able to bring it to an end before its time has elapsed. The cost is tremendous. The director was not at home, but his manager, an Englishman from South Africa, showed us great hospitality. In his company we made an excursion far into the valley, where the open ground comes to an end and the roble forest replaces it. We here met one of the most notable Patagonian mammals, the small tuco, Tenemus magellanicus. A lovely gnar, somewhat recalling the lemming. It lives on the roots of plants and digs labyrinths of tunnels, completely undermining the soil. Without suspecting anything you come along at a canter. Suddenly the horse goes through with his front legs. You had better proceed cautiously or you will easily get your horse hurt. Sometimes it is not possible to avoid the tuco ground. We had to cross the river several times before we came to the forest belt. Here for the first time I saw the Andine deer, the huemul, Furcifer chilensis, in company with the condor supporter in Chile's coat of arms. Like other deer the huemul is of elegant appearance. Its color is light brown with white on the belly. The horns are no remarkable trophy, generally they only have 4 points. 50 years ago the huemul was regarded as a rare animal. There was even a time when he was almost as mythological as the unicorn or the griffin. But from the Boundary Commission we learnt that he is common in the dry forest belt east of the Andes. There his well-marked paths cross each other in all directions, running from the mountain meadows down to the streams in the valleys. This day I regarded him only as a friend of nature does, but later we welcomed him in order to see his life's blood. However, we never killed for the sport of it. We were just back in the farm and it was getting dark when we heard the sounds of an approaching caravan, which soon arrived, horsemen, a troop, and the high-wheeled Pampas carriage. It was the director, Mr. Brand, who had arrived from the coast. He brought his wife and a baby 1 month old with him. They had been shaken a fortnight on the rough camp, but did not look any the worse for that. Mr. Brand seemed very enthusiastic in his work, but told the rather amusing story that the company's directors in London are so despotic that he dared not shear a sheep without asking permission by telegraph. Concerning the future, he did not hide from himself that it looked dark for the moment, but better days might, of course, be in store. Many a time as one is looking out over the fertile Subandine valleys, one is ready to listen to those optimists who prophesy a splendid future. They please your eye: well-watered meadows, streams of great horsepower, forests with good timber, and the Cordillera with all its grandeur. The lack of communications, however, is the great drawback, causing the ruin of people, especially if they have to clear roads to Chile. Our way south was closed by the mountains round the lakes Fontana and La Plata, and we found it better to make a detour around the foot of the mountains out on the open Pampas, which truly was not in accordance with our principles. At the pass over the Sengar River, the outlet of the above-mentioned lakes, a German has established a combined store and public house. Further down the river live some colonists. It looked as if Rio Sengar had devoured all the water of the neighborhood. Under a broiling Sunday sun we rode into the mountains, but nowhere a drop of running water, one lagoon after the other, so white that one tasted the salt far off, green grass and nice flowers, but not the characteristic fringe of brushwood indicating a murmuring brook. This day we came across the largest herd of guanacos we ever saw, not less than 400 or 500, a magnificent sight. We had now spent a couple of days in Argentina. Again we arrived in Chile, but that did not help us, for we had to ride 34 miles before we found water. Down in a valley a dark band of foliage wound. Out of it the white skeletons of dead trees stood gaunt and lone, promising us a regular campfire. Round the east basin of Rio XIII with its numerous tributaries Chile has drawn its frontier line. Again we were among forests and mountains, and the open spaces which are not a result of man's labor are easily counted. Our way led into the valley of Rio Nirihuao, where well-developed terraces on the sides attracted our attention, and on November 25 we reached the first estancia belonging to Compañía Industrial del Rio XIII, where a kind Scotchman offered us such dainties as we had forgotten the existence of: milk, butter, bread, all fresh. Very soon we got to know that we were back in the forest region. Spoiled by dry and sunny weather, we did not like to experience cold or rain or snow. To the east the sky was clear over the steppe, to the west a rainy fog rested heavily on the forest-clad ridges. In a snowstorm we left this place in order to ride down to the main estancia. The company has made a road between the two places, which, considering the difficulties, cannot be called bad at all. We met a party of shepherds employed in lamb marking. Ewes and lambs had been driven together into large flocks. There was a bleating in all sorts of keys. The lambs are driven into one paddock, the mothers into another. The small, kicking beasts are caught, and off comes the tail and the ear is bitten through. If it be a ram he is castrated, a cut, and the testicles are hauled out with the teeth. Certainly not a very agreeable, but nevertheless a practical method. Then the poor creatures are let loose, and rush in among the ewes with wild jumps, making a sorry music looking for their mothers. The route winds over a meseta, reaches a height of about 3,000 feet, and drops again into the Coyhaique Valley. The river is one of Rio XIII's tributaries. It rained hard when we rode through the high roble forest. The farther west we came the worse was the road, in some places hardly passable. For long stretches it was plastered with sticks, giving our horses much trouble and bringing them innumerable lashes. Some of the rebellious ones took their own way through the thickets and gave us extra work. Here and there the forest had been burnt, and sheep ran about among the black skeletons. Pavo, who, according to his custom, regarded sheep exactly as guanacos, soon got his hide well tanned. It was not very pleasant to come as guests to a farm with a dog who would worry sheep. The sun burst forth. From a hill we beheld the XIII Valley at our feet. Here and there a bend of the river was visible between thick foliage, which glittered from the rain. About 8 miles further down we saw the houses of Coyhaique Bajo, our destination, and in the evening of November 26 we made our entry there. It was the biggest place we had seen since Bariloche. The houses are arranged in 2 lines with a broad street between them, and Flax as well as Johansson, who had never seen anything so imposing, visibly protested against such an excess of civilization. The head of the place, Mr. Dunn, was not at home, but he had written to his people, evidently asking them to treat us well, for they did so, promising to put people and horses at our disposal, so that our own animals got a week which they sorely needed to gorge upon fat grass and heal their backs. Here, amidst the wildest wilderness, on all sides surrounded by virgin forests and mountains, was a small piece of old England, English language, food, and customs. Many a spare hour we spent in Mr. Stewart's cozy home, where he and his old wife vied with each other in taking care of us, offering us all sorts of dainties, almost too sharply contrasting with our plain diet. Our principal task here was to ride down to the Pacific, using the road made by the company. We borrowed a troop of big, strong horses, a mule for the cargo, and a small, fat chilote boy. Paggles had to stop behind, well occupied with mending and darning our damaged property. At a cost of 350,000 pesos, the company has constructed a road of 51 miles down to the mouth of Rio Asin, unlike even the worst road you may find in the United Kingdom. We must not expect too much, however, for the difficulties here are enormous. Across are round narrow abysses, climbing zigzag, through stony, rushing waters, on narrow bridges over the precipices, thus runs the first and best part of it. Then come the steep granite barrancas along the river, where the road has been blasted in the shape of a shelf in the wall. It makes a turn and crosses the Baguales Ridge. Here's the boundary between the easier roble forest and the evergreen one, which I have introduced to the reader on several occasions. Once more we entered the kingdom of eternal rain. On both sides the forest stands, dense as a wall, with bamboo thickets and creepers high up in trees, and the limited space left is filled by half-rotten trunks. A never-ceasing rain completes the picture. The poncho is heavy as lead with water, and our boots are filled slowly but surely. Now and then our steeds shake off the water, and then fall into their old tempo again. The road is terrible. The horses wade knee-deep through a tough clay or a loose black mud, where one never knows how deep it is to the bottom and where the entangled roots trip them up. Now and then, often for half a mile or so, the road is plastered with sticks. Here one does not sink down, but it is slippery as glass instead, and we are filled with admiration of the sure-footedness of the horses. On downward slopes it felt like it might feel riding down a staircase, an experience I never had. We halted at Rio Manuales, thus named because there are large quantities of manio, in this case Saxagothia conspicua, on its banks. It is the largest tributary, and Hallie and I resolved to stop there. Quencel ferried across it and continued down to the coast. With dripping clothes we sat down by the hearth in the small cottage where the ferryman lives, and soon his 3 little girls gathered round us, curiously looking at the travelers from a far country. Their mother offered us a cup of tea and told us about the monotonous life in the forest. Sometimes the rain makes the road impassable and one is cut off from the rest of the world. Sometimes the river rises, causing serious inundations. Last spring it had carried away one of the ferries and threatened the house with disaster. She was very proud of her husband, who was away for the day, and showed us his medal with 3 clasps from the South African War. For once the climate gave up its bad ways and we got a comparatively fine day with only a few showers. The air was filled with the strong scent of laurel, Laurelia serrata, order Monomiaceae, and Orion, Merceeugenia apiculata, a myrtle tree. The Corcolian, Azara lanceolata, order Flaccordiaceae, was completely covered with golden mimosa balls. The Ceruellillo, Embothrium coccineum, order Proteaceae, was on fire with clusters of crimson flowers. Yellow violets, fine orchids, mamulus, and calceolarias adorned the soil. At the river the bamboo, Chusquea colihue, showed a luxuriance I did not see in any other place, about 30 feet high, and so thick that it could be used for building purposes. One would hardly believe that it is only 2 or 3 days' journey to the dry steppe. Quencel returned after a boat trip to Puerto Chacabuco, with greetings from El Pacifico, and now we all went back. We had reached our goal, had made a botanical as well as geological section through the mountains, and the following days were spent in detailed studies of certain interesting places. On our return, just as we were about to climb the slopes of the Baguales hill, we heard shouting from above, and slowly a caravan of bullock carts came down the sharp turns of the road. As one sees these monstrous carts with their 3 or 4 pairs of oxen, one understands what it costs to keep a forest road in order. We had to wait till they had passed. Progress is not rapid, they need 3 days for the trip. Now and then we met chilotes occupied in repairing the road after the devastations of the spring flood. In Coyhaique we bought provisions for the next part of our journey. Hitherto we had met people now and then and found great assistance, but between Asin and Lake San Martin, where we intended to make our next stay, we could hardly count on meeting any inhabitants after the first days of March. We thus had to carry with us everything except meat, and the load was almost heavier than at our first start. The provisions, calculated to last 30 days, consisted of about the same variety as before. However, we could get neither oatmeal nor biscuits, but had to bring a flour bag. The result was that bread was of rare occurrence on our table. It took too much time to make it. Pancakes were easier made. Besides, it was good to have something to long for and to celebrate feast days with. From Puerto Montt we had sent a box by steamer to XIII. There was paper for drying plants, spirits, formalin, and C. We left 2 boxes of collections in care of the company to be forwarded to Punta Arenas. Only in this way was it possible to make more extensive collections. We had already sent 1 box from Leleje and another from Valle Frias, and we hoped to find them all on our arrival. On December 3rd our caravan started again. On account of the rest and the good grass our horses were very fresh, and with greater speed than usual we disappeared between the forest groves, followed by the waving of the XIII people. Chapter 13. Lake Buenos Aires. During the first few hours we followed the Coyhaique Valley back the same way we had come, and then turned south in order to cross a ridge, separating us from the Mayo Valley, which did not look very inviting. A disagreeable yellow-brown color told us that we should find the crossing of it unpleasant. Generally we all used to ride after the troop, 2 just behind and 1 on each flank, but here we came to a passage where 2 of us had to keep ahead of the caravan and survey the camp, or we might be bogged without a warning. The swamps are very treacherous here, and sometimes we climbed a hill to get a view of the terrain. Now and then we tried to follow the track of a guanaco. This is, however, no particularly safe device, for where the light guanaco can pass a heavy horse might easily sink down. I rode solo for the first time after his recovery. He sank up to his girths twice, and I had to throw myself off instantly and get him on safe ground again. Rio Mayo presents a good example of a very small brook offering serious difficulties. If a stream, running deep down in a sort of furrow with the peat projecting like a shelf above the water, is so broad that it cannot be jumped, it is anything but easy to get the horses across. It is not so bad if there is a firm bed, but in many cases the animal sinks deep down in loose mud and is lost. Also a bed of sand or gravel may be troublesome. Even if one can urge the beast down, it is much labor to get him up again, the peat everywhere giving way under his hoofs. It is of the utmost importance to find a suitable ford, even if it should cost you loss of time. Along a considerable distance of Rio Mayo we found only 1 place where we could cross this insignificant stream, and it took us half an hour's hard labor before we had the horses safe on the other side. The main thing is to master the mare. The others will follow her, if they are not like Ruckel or Jeremiah's, who had wills of their own and nearly turned our hair gray. The Mayo Valley is said to be one of the last refuges for half-wild Tehuelches, living in their toldos in the ancient manner. We did not see any traces of them, but at a distance sighted a rancho, horses and cattle indicating that the valley was inhabited. We had no time to stop. In front of us lay a great obstacle, a meseta raising its barrancas to a height of 4,750 feet. There is a path cut through the forest west of this mountain, but it had not been used for a long time and was said to be almost impassable. The people in XIII had advised us not to try it. They did not know anything of the meseta itself, but thought it would be easier to cross it. To ride round its east end is simple, but did not suit our plans. Meseta Shalia, named thus because the Rio Shalia originates on its west plateaus, consists of loose material and lacks the basaltic crust that made the Table Mountains so dreaded. But we were soon to see that the difficulties were not less here. A trying climb commenced, and leading the horses in zigzag we reached the edge of the plateau, extending in front of us level as a floor and covered with round stones like cobbles. It reminded us of the marketplace in a small town. For the most part there was no vegetation, only strips of a meager heath of diddledy, strikingly recalling alpine tundra. We waited some minutes to recover our breath, and then set out. Some few steps. What does this mean? The pavement, looking so firm and safe, will not bear us. Between the blocks, which fret the skin, the horses go down into a terrible viscous stuff. When the snow melted the soil had been saturated with water. It is what geologists call solifluction, though the soil does not move, the ground being fairly horizontal. Some snow patches were still left, at their edge there was no bottom. It was desperate work. To ride was not to be thought of. We tramped and tramped, dragging our saddle horses and whipping the others. We struggled to get onto the firm strips of heath where we could breathe a moment, which we really deserved, for the misery lasted several hours. Suddenly we found ourselves at the edge of a ravine, so steep that we had not observed it till we were close on it. Every small brook, fed by the snowdrifts, has cut a very deep canyon, The sides are clad with thickets of near, dense as a hawthorn hedge, and the bottom is filled up by wretched swamps. But we must go down it. The horses disappeared in the thick carpet, the loads were caught up by the branches, and we needed all our energy to assemble the caravan in the bottom of the ravine, where we found a very welcome camping place. The next morning we first worked our way out of the canyon, and stood on the plateau again ready to recommence the fight. It grew still worse than the day before. Not even the patches of heath bore us. The horses strove to get there, only to find them occupied by the burrows of the tuco-tuco. Numerous ravines had to be crossed. We made a small detour higher up on the meseta, where we crossed the last, or rather first, rivulets on snow bridges, at a height of 4,600 feet. It was ridiculous to see the horses' fright at the snow, hitherto only seen from some distance. They required both abuse and the whip, but eventually obeyed, and that was the principal thing. Finally we stood at the end of the meseta. 3,000 feet below extended the Kozlowski Valley, with inviting green meadows. On the other side was another meseta, and to our right was the main range of the Andes, blue and violet in the pale evening light. Now arose the question of getting down into the fine valley, which was more easily said than done. The slope fell away perilously near a right angle. It was furrowed by numerous rivulets, hidden under entangled near thickets. We prospected along the edge of the plateau, and, as nothing better could be seen, chose the least uninviting of the ravines. I dare say none of us will ever forget that descent. Hardly able to find foothold, the horses simply slid down the slopes. Now and then one fell, but got on his feet again. Another broke away, made desperate efforts to gallop up again, and then stopped without knowing what to do. I do not remember how many times we had to let go the horses, climb up on hands and knees, and drive down the much-cursed ruckle, but I know he tried our patience to the utmost. Rather shaken, we and the horses eventually reached the bottom of the ravine. The slopes were clad with forest growth and were very steep, and our only chance was to follow the dry, stony river bed, where huge blocks sometimes barred the way. Thousands of trunks had rolled down from the sides, forming irregular barricades and stopping the march times innumerable. The horses lost their senses, rushed to the sides, dashed into blind alleys, turned round and tried to get back up the canyon. We divided the troop up, each of us taking charge of some animals. Step by step we advanced, giving encouraging shouts, and lashing and chasing fugitives, who baffled all our efforts to keep order. Here indeed was a good opportunity for Jeremias to distinguish himself, and to be sure he did not fail. Lagging behind for a second, he took advantage of an unguarded moment, turned aside, and climbed up through the forest with a speed and energy that he never showed otherwise, and disappeared. A special expedition was sent to fetch him down, and he got a well-deserved thrashing. I had always suspected that horses have not got much real intelligence, but after studying them in all sorts of situations I know that they have not. By and by, when the slopes became less steep and the forest higher and less dense, we took refuge in it. One of us acted as guide, and with some patience one could get the yegua to follow. Then it was the business of the drivers to keep the others together. With loud shouts of joy we greeted the open ground, though we could easily keep from laughing when we discovered that the tuco-tuco had taken possession of it. At some distance a large animal sprang to its feet, made some cat-like leaps, and was out of sight. Pagels said that it was a puma, Felis concolor, and very likely it was. The puma, here generally called El Leon, is the largest and most dangerous of the carnivora in Patagonia. He is very common, but seldom seen, keeping out of the way by day. He does not assault man unless wounded, but takes to his heels. However, he is the most dreaded enemy of the sheep, killing them not only for food, but also for the sport of it. Often he returns to his prey, and advantage is taken of that habit to poison the carcass with strychnine, and the next day may find the puma only a few yards from the lamb. To our surprise we did not at once find a camping place with running water. Several of the rivulets from the meseta disappeared in the swamps at its foot. But finally we found an idyllic little place, and were not long in off-saddling. Both we and the horses were longing for a rest. We had marched 10 hours without stopping, and even if the distance did not much exceed 20 miles we did not feel ashamed of the result. It proved necessary to give the horses a day's rest. For as these days were no rest, generally they were employed in long excursions on foot. The flora of the Kozlowski Valley is rich in species. The summer had now come, and a lot of plants, new to me, were in full flower. We were without meat, and Quenzel went to look for human dwellings, which were reported as existing in the valley, while Pagels took the Winchester and went to shoot something. In the evening we were all back in the camp, each with his prey. Quenzel had met a mestizo, who led him to his rancho and gave him meat. Pagels returned with some small ducks and a hen eagle. She had some very welcome eggs inside her, which were delightful in the soup. We had had a very meager diet the last few days, but now made up for the loss. Quenzel had promised the people in the rancho that we would visit them when we crossed the valley. Their miserable hut, almost a veritable toldo, lay hidden in a valley. The small river joins Rio Humules, which in its turn discharges into Asin. The husband, Jose, was of mixed breed, half Chilean, half Araucanian. His wife was pure Indian and had been a real beauty. We sat down with the family. Evidently we were expected, for when the lid was taken off the cauldron it was found to contain rice gruel. As far as I know I never showed any predilection for this dish before, and today it seems peculiar that I then ate 3 platefuls with great gusto. So it was, however. Jose told us that there was quite a new and small settlement on the other side of the valley, and gave us directions for our march. After a while we came to a cottage, where half a dozen sheepdogs rushed out barking frantically and calling out the inhabitant. He was an Englishman called Brooks, a very nice man, who had settled with about 2,000 sheep and seemed to enjoy his life thoroughly. With him lived also a Dane, who was glad to find his native tongue for once understood. Brooks is one of the few camp men I met who was interested in nature. He started to speak of the steppe flora, and showed me a couple of rare plants that he had in his garden. We wanted to get on after a short while, but the kind souls were so persistent and we found ourselves so comfortable that we resolved to stop for the night, the more so as the Dane, Espersen, offered to show us the best pass over to the next valley. In the evening Mr. Lundberg, from Kuopio, in Finland, came riding in, and invited us to visit his place further west in the valley, which we were sorry not to be able to do. His mother tongue was Finnish. Once he had also spoken some Swedish, but 25 years had made him forget both and he had never learned a new language thoroughly. He was best acquainted with English. His case is not unique, I am sure. The Kozlowski Valley lies only 1,000 feet above the sea and looks fertile. Probably it will be colonized before long. In this connection the following story from the boundary dispute may be told. According to the rule that water divide equals boundary, this valley would have gone to Chile as well as the Asin district. But Argentina put forth the following impressive facts. It was already colonized, there was a scheme, one could point to the Casa Kozlowski, a wooden hut, on the map, and last, not least, there was a photo of the telegraph line there. This telegraph line I have myself seen on more than one Argentine map. At the house there are 14 telegraph posts, with a wire coming from nowhere and going nowhere. Inside is apparatus that never spoke and piles of paper strips on the floor. By the award Argentina kept all the valuable part of the valley. It was December 8th when, in company with Mr. Espersen, we started to cross the pass along the east slope of Meseta Guengel and descend to the large depression where Lake Buenos Aires extends, the largest of the Patagonian lakes. It was an agreeable ride in bends and turns between the forest patches. The rise was not so bad but that it permitted us to remain on horseback all the time, and at 3,400 feet we reached our highest point. From there we beheld the vast expanse of the lake, with blue mountains behind. In the east the lake reaches the Pampas. The western arms penetrate far into the mountains, as far as the edge of the inland ice, with a row of giant summits making one of the most magnificent pieces of scenery of Andean landscape, and culminating in the 2 peaks San Clemente and San Valentin, the latter with its 13,000 feet being the highest mountain in Patagonia. On the maps as well as in descriptions these mountains are often called volcanoes, but there is no foundation for such a designation. Probably they are of the same nature as San Lorenzo, mentioned below. Lake Buenos Aires has a surface area of about 800 square miles, thus being almost 4 times as large as the Bodin Lake. We were sorry not to have a boat, and had to keep along the shore. The lake empties in Rio Baker. As the reader will remember, we were close to its mouth in June. We camped early that day. Quenzel and Pagels went to prepare the dinner and I got time to look at the vegetation. On the sandy banks near the river Phoenix, where we had our camp, I found quite a number of species I did not know, of which several had just been described as from other parts of Patagonia. Halley continued his studies in the geology of the Table Mountains. Here he also found fossil plants. When we got back Quenzel had baked bread, and otherwise made extensive preparations for a feast. That is to say, he had boiled a potful of dried figs, all in order to impress our guest, who stayed for the night. I suspect that he had been used to far better kitchens than ours. The next morning we parted, he went back and we continued along the Phoenix Valley. It was as if midsummer had come at a bound. The air was oppressive, the sand burnt, the horses dripped with sweat, and every time we tracked a bend of the river the dogs plunged into the cold water to cool their sore feet. Rio Phoenix winds in innumerable serpentines, bordered by a green fringe. Now it leaves a level plateau free at the foot of the barranca. Now it cuts so close into it that one must pass with caution. We sit half dozing in the saddle, too warmly dressed for a day like this, when suddenly there is a stir. Now and then we have passed a small troop of guanacos, but not even the dogs had taken any interest in them. At once we discover that they have young ones amongst them. The dogs are after them and there is a wild hunt. At first the guanacos gain, the small ones straining every endeavor to keep up with the others, and they show a tremendous turn of speed. Now one falls behind, the gap between the small one and the fleeing herd widens. The dogs are there. Now it is for us to interfere, or they will tear him to pieces and spoil the meat. It is a very pretty little thing, about a fortnight or 3 weeks old, with beautiful wool like yellowish red silk on the back and with a white belly. In triumph it is brought to the caravan and added to the load. If one can call the meat of full-grown guanaco very eatable, which I maintain is no exaggeration, that of the young must certainly be characterized as delicious. It tastes like the finest veal, and I refuse to tell how much we ate the first time we had it. Only very occasionally is the guanaco killed for the sake of its meat. On the whole the older animals are seldom hunted, but the younger more often. Their skin is very much appreciated, and is used for the celebrated quilongos, mantles, which every traveler who passes Punta Arenas or any of the small ports on the Atlantic is able to procure. Even if he has not time to go on shore, he may be pretty sure they will come on board. The deck is soon carpeted with products in the way of fur from Patagonia, guanaco and fox, puma and ostrich, and the valuable otter from the channels. And every passenger steamer brings with it quite a collection of skins and imitation Indian curiosities, all sold at advanced prices for the occasion. A common guanaco mantle measures 10 to 11 square feet, and is made of from 13 to 15 young animals. In Punta Arenas it costs 50 to 80 pesos, according to the exchange, for in reality one has to pay in English pounds and shillings. Another kind of mantle is made only from the soft skin of the head and legs of the full-grown guanaco. It requires a very great number of animals, and prices run high. I very seldom saw these offered for sale. The beginning of December is the season for the guanaco hunters. They swarm in certain parts of the Andean Pampas, and for the most part do a thriving business. We saw their fires on the north slope of the Phoenix Valley. I have heard there are some game laws for guanacos and ostriches, but they are probably ignored, for it is hardly possible to maintain any effective control in the vast uninhabited territories. Hardly had we begun to move again when the next, plucked and roasted pigeon flew into our mouths. It was a small armadillo, a common Dasypus minutus. The small armored ball rolled away, but did not reach its hole before we had it. After a while we caught another. These animals are delicious cooked and eaten cold, or roasted in their hard coats. He who has been lucky enough to try a pig roasted whole in a Scania parsonage can imagine what an armadillo is like. Small baskets made of varnished armadillo, with its tail in its mouth, are among the most common souvenirs brought from Argentina. These animals belong to an order that in ancient times played an important part. The surviving species are dwarfs in comparison with those which lived on the Pampas during the Tertiary period, true giants, the armor of which is beautifully represented in the collection of the famous Museo de la Plata. We had not come across armadillos till we came to the Phoenix Valley. Later on we saw them at times, and they never had time to get clear, since we knew what they were good for. They live on locusts and other insects, and to judge from the contents of their stomachs there is no lack of such. The midday sun became too hot for us, and especially for our horses. Nowhere was there an inch of shade, but nevertheless we made a halt at the river, off-saddled, and took a rest. We wanted to make tea, but not being used to the great heat and drought, we were not cautious enough in making a fire. In less than a second the grass all round was all ablaze, and the fire rapidly spread with the wind, threatening our baggage, which was instantly taken out of reach of it, though not without some small losses. However, we had to isolate it without delay, and the coffee pot, the cauldron, and Quenzel's waterproof hat sped to and fro from the river, while we at the same time tried to stamp out the flaming tussocks. After an hour's work the danger, which might have had serious consequences, was nipped in the bud. Further down the river we came upon a sort of peculiar bush vegetation, well worth being studied, and we stayed there the next day. Accompanied by Hallie, I strolled about all day, and went back loaded with specimens. The bushes, fine species of lycium, verbena, and others, were in full flower everywhere in the hot sand. Beautiful yellow flowers of Alstroemeria pygmaea peeped out, as well as small spiny cactus with large yellow, red, and white blossoms. I had to find out a method of conveying the prickly things with me, but they landed home in good condition. Between the tussocks many-colored lizards scurried to and fro, black and yellow, brown with red and white markings or with a copper luster, always making me think of Pagels, who entertained an inextinguishable passion for these animals. All of a sudden we would see him stop, jump from his horse, and pursue some speedy lizard, that often was caught in his cap, to be afterwards transferred to an old pickle bottle he carried in his maletas. The bottle always leaked, and when he looked at his treasures Pagels always lamented, Herr Doktor, jetzt gehen meine Eidechsen vollkommen kaputt. When Quenzel and Pagels, who had been out doing geology and hunting, returned we all took a bath in the river. The hunting had yielded poor results. They had come across some guanacos, but the feet of the dogs were so damaged by the hot sand that not even the young could attract them. By the river were plenty of geese, and with regret we thought of our gun. With the Winchester we got only a scraggy gander. At sunset it grew rapidly chilly, and the thermometer fell to freezing point, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which did not prevent its running up next day to 86 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade again. We followed the river for some distance, and then took a short cut across the hilly country down to Lake Buenos Aires. Here we chanced among a veritable labyrinth of sand dunes. We started to look for ostrich eggs, and succeeded in finding 2. Unfortunately they were addled. Such eggs, the only drawback is that it takes 20 minutes to boil them, and then they are but lightly boiled. The reason we did not follow the river was that it runs east for some miles before turning south, and finally west, emptying into the lake. It is a rather peculiar river. Just east of its bend another river, the Deseado, starts from a swamp, fed by occasional tributaries from the north. Further down other streams join it, and now visible, now disappearing in the marshes, it runs across Patagonia and discharges into the Atlantic. The water parting between Deseado and Phoenix, i.e., between the Atlantic and the Pacific, is very insignificant. Rio Phoenix has only just abandoned its old course to the Atlantic, and it was possible for Dr. Moreno to remove some of the morainic material and coax it back for a while. Even now it sometimes sends water to Rio Deseado. At the east end of the lake there is almost a desert, dry, stony plains where the few plants look like monsters. To such a degree have they adapted themselves to an abnormal life. One is agreeably surprised when suddenly the canyon of Phoenix River opens at one's feet. There is luscious green grass. The horses betray delight at this sight, and it is easier than usual to drive them down the steep barranca. We made our camp not far from the outlet of the river, where traces of one of the encampments of the Boundary Commission still remained. Our supply of meat was finished. The dogs had to live on their own fat, not much to speak of, and we made inroads upon our poor vegetables. A cool breeze from the lake welcomed us as we rode out of the canyon to go round the east end of the big water, and the waves broke in over the shingle, which was adorned by large flowered yellow oenotheras. I have seldom seen anything more inanimate than nature here. There was not a bird to be seen on the water, not an animal in the ravines running down to the shore from the south. Here and there white guanaco bones gleamed in the bushes, but not a living thing was to be seen. We made a halt in the canyon of Rio Chilcas and camped. A rumor had spoken of fossils having been found there. Quenzel and Hallie were busy looking for them. I myself spent the time as usual, and Pagels tried to replenish our pantry, but he returned empty-handed, and supper was identical with breakfast, pancakes of wheat flour and water. On the north shore of the lake there is a small settlement that we did not see. Otherwise the whole region is uninhabited, in spite of the good grass along Phoenix and south of the lake, which lies only 712 feet above sea level, for which reason the winters cannot be very severe. An abandoned rancho not far from the Chilcas Valley showed that people have lived here for some time. The geologists' efforts proved futile, which did not surprise them. The kind of rock was not promising for the discovery of fossil remains, and we resolved to leave the place and move our camp to Rio Janemani, which we were to follow to a pass across the mountains. We left the lake, but enjoyed a last sight of it, following the shore at some distance, and higher up making for Rio de los Antiguos, which runs parallel with Rio Janemani, and the canyon of which we should have to cross. We rested an hour near some lagoons, and in vain tried to get some birds. There were numbers of black-necked swans and ducks, but the swans kept far off from the shore and the ducks hid themselves in the reeds. At random we cut across a plateau to reach the river, and there we had a narrow escape. Arrived at the edge of the canyon, We saw the river whirling below, and the barranca was about 450 feet high. How were we to get down? A safe method would have been to follow the river down and cross it near the mouth, as we could see from the map that it must be more fordable there. However, this meant loss of time and did not suit us. We experienced the truth of the proverb, more haste, less speed. We rode to a point from where we got a view up the valley, but nowhere could we see a passage. All along the barranca fell away almost vertically. Just below our feet, however, was a sandy slope with some bushes, falling off at an angle of 45 degrees. What came after we could not see, the rest of the barranca being too steep to be visible from where we were. But Pagels assured us that he could see a very good place, and we started to slide down. It went all right for a while, though it was, of course, some time before we got the horses to understand what a fine way we had found for them. Our delight was of short duration. After a few minutes we found ourselves at the top of a hard, nearly vertical sandstone wall without the slightest trace of vegetation. To turn back was out of the question. Fortunately, the mountain here is furrowed by small streams during the spring floods, and there was nothing to be done but climb down one of the ravines, where stones and loose blocks, plunging down at the slightest touch, made the descent very risky. We had hard work to force the horses down the ravine. It was so narrow, the section was V-shaped, that we had to crawl in single file. Repeatedly a horse would dash at the sides. Instantly he had to be driven back, or he went to certain death. Step by step they were literally whipped down, sliding and falling, stumbling on treacherous blocks. The whip brought them to their feet again, and one after the other landed safely in the thickets at the foot of the barranca. Pagels had remained behind to look for Ruckel, who on this day was carrying tent and provisions. He had refused to come with the other horses, and disappeared in the bushes to find his own private way down. Quenzel and Hallie climbed up to see what was going forward, but I found waiting tiresome, tied the horses, and climbed the wall following another ravine. I had come halfway when I stopped and shouted, but did not get any answer. I could see nothing, climbed down again and walked along the foot, and suddenly a dreadful sight met my eyes. Halfway up the wall, at the end of a small ravine ending abruptly, stood Ruckel, with his load hanging loose, his legs entangled in the ropes, trembling from head to foot, and without the most microscopical chance of getting up or down, to right or left. Straight above him on the slope were my comrades. How had he got there? He had fallen, tumbled down sideways with load and all, rolled about 90 feet, and was lucky to recover his foothold at the very last moment. Another inch and he would have been dashed to pieces. Hallie and Quenzel had seen him fall, and hastened up to end his sufferings with a merciful bullet. To their immense surprise they found him standing upright. The small space where he was able to keep on his feet sloped down. At any moment his strength might give out and he would be precipitated down and probably killed, for below him the barranca sloped inward. There seemed nothing to be done. I climbed up till I stood under him. The ropes were cut and the things lowered down to me, and I carried them down. As far as we could see the beast was not much injured, and was only bleeding very little, so we of course wanted to save him. Just below him, to the left, a small ridge protruded. Could we get him across it? There was a small ravine leading down. Lying on his stomach and clinging to the projections on the rock in a manner hardly believable, Pagels dug some steps in the sandstone with my sheath knife, Ruckel regarding him immovable as the Sphinx. Pagels crept down, tugged at the cabresta. Well, I hardly know what happened. Some rapid steps half in the air. An instant he lay floundering and kicking with his belly across the ridge, then was dragged into the ravine and saved. Rubber must have gone to the construction of a good deal of his body, for the following morning he was not even lame. Ruckel had celebrated Lucia Day in his own original way, and now we could laugh at the adventure. When we looked at the barranca from below we could hardly believe that we had come down there. The affair had cost time, and we saw ourselves forced to camp at Rio Antiguos, where another unsuccessful shoot forced us to continue our pancake diet and the dogs to go with empty stomachs. We were off early the next morning, for we wanted to cross the river when there was not so much water as later in the day. It was easier to climb out of the canyon than it had been to get into it, and so we went on to Rio Janemani. This river is the frontier between Chile and Argentina. We thought the best way to the pass would be to follow the bank of the river, and therefore climb down into the magnificent canyon. There was a stony strip of land along the water where we could ride, but owing to the innumerable turns one could not look ahead for more than a very short distance at a time. We had not been underway long before we had to alight and lead the horses. Now the barranca sent sharp ridges out in the water, where a false step would have been fatal. Now we came across heaps of blocks and debris fallen down from the wall, now deep ravines, to get across which one almost needed trained circus horses. If one risked remaining in the saddle, one hardly escaped getting literally torn off by the tough near branches. We sent Pagels ahead to signal if any serious obstacle appeared. All of a sudden a barranca ran almost vertically down into the river, leaving a passage about 2 or 3 feet broad. Some bushes increased the difficulties. Steady, the mare looks at the water, but it does not seem very inviting. Then she throws a glance full of unsatisfied desire towards the sky, but 90 degrees was evidently too much for her, and anxiously squinting at last she walks the right way, followed by the other party in single file. Suddenly full stop, Pagels has stopped to clear away some bushes. We shout to him to hurry up, but it is already too late. Jeremias has taken the lead. With firm resolution he turns right, crosses a branch of the river, and lands on a sandbank, where he stops looking more stupid than ever. Evidently the mare finds his idea brilliant, and plunges after him, and the other loose horses are not behindhand in following their example. We caught one of the pack horses before he had time to carry his evil plans into execution, but the other, Manas, was already in the middle of the rapid stream, and with mixed feelings we saw the water washing his load. Fortunately he carried the cases. There was no time for cogitation. Once out in the main branch Manas would probably have perished. Pagels hastened after the fugitives and brought them back. It was a narrow escape. We might have lost valuable collections, journals, and notebooks. The going was wretched, but we continued up the river till the barranca made further progress absolutely impossible. We climbed up about 1,000 feet to try if it was not better up there. Pagels was sent ahead with the Winchester, and a deer really came within range. However, the distance was great, and though hit the animal did not drop, but rushed down the slope and fled into Chile. That is to say, he swam over the river, where he fell down dead. The dogs rushed after him, threw themselves into the water, the current took them, and they were hardly able to reach the shore. We did not know if there was any ford. At this hour of the day the river looked like boiling mud, and it was not without risk to try to wade it. However, Quenzel, on Flax, the most reliable of our horses, offered to try, and Hallie and I drove the troop to a suitable halting place. Pagels stopped at the river to help Quenzel. Half an hour passed, 1 hour. We began to get anxious and walked down the slope, and were glad indeed to meet them, Flax carrying a pair of substantial deer steaks on the saddle. Quenzel had got a bath in the river and had had a narrow escape. He declared that with any other horse he would not have been successful. "You will never see Pavo any more," he added. We were very sorry at the loss of the dog, but at the same time glad that nothing worse had happened, and our sorrow did not last long, for whom did we see after a while, lumbering up the slope, but Pavo, exhausted and dripping with water. It had grown late, Quenzel's clothes were soaked, and we resolved to camp on the spot, in spite of the fuel being very scarce and the water bad. We had to fetch it from a small pond so full of tiny crustaceans that it turned quite red when boiled. We had a great feast of venison, and both ourselves and the dogs enjoyed a hearty meal. We also found time to prospect for the next day, and saw that we must keep high above the river. It was a mistake ever to try the bottom of the canyon. We resumed at a height of from 2,200 to 3,000 feet. It turned out all right, and we camped at Rio Zabayos, at 3,300 feet, the largest tributary to Janemini, in the most inviting, dry, fragrant roble forest. We had a cold night and there was thick ice in the coffee pot when we rose. The horses enjoyed the fresh mountain pasturage, and Quenzel and I employed the day in an excursion on foot up into the mountains. We soon found a guanaco track that we could follow for more than 1,000 feet. Now and then a guanaco was seen, and once we sat down and remained immovable, I with the camera. Making smaller and smaller circles, one approached, stopped now and then, gave a neigh and pricked up his ears. He felt some anxiety, but curiosity overcame it, and I snapped him from about 100 feet. Later we tried the same maneuver with a fat deer, but I wanted to get closer, and he was frightened and made off. Above the forests we climbed over rattling heaps of loose slates. Numbers of charming alpine plants were in flower among debris and snowfields, and from a crest of 5,700 feet we had a splendid view. To the east the mighty basalt covered Meseta. To the north we cast a last glance at Lake Buenos Aires, where the smoke from the guanaco hunters' camp was still visible. To the west deep, forest-clad valleys and summits, not yet found on any map. To the south the Zabayos Pass, our battlefield for the coming day. We felt monarchs up here, as if these immense Alps, the snowdrifts, flowers and noble animals were our property. Never is the sense of freedom greater than in the high mountain air with a good expanse of the earth below one's feet. Down we went, faster than we had come up. We slid down the steep, loose heaps of stones, half ran through the mountain swamps where red-brown geese had their nests, and dived into the forest. Only Pavo was in the camp when we arrived there. Later Pagels arrived with some guanaco meat. He had been on the meseta where our way led, and said that he had surveyed a beautiful track for the march. We received this not uncommon information with equanimity, born of long experience. Thank you for listening to Part 3 of The Wilds of Patagonia, by Carl Skottsberg. If you enjoyed so far, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss when the next part is released. We'll continue the journey in Part 4. See you there.